Join me on a journey of building a new community around ideas of local engagement to discuss solutions to our national dilemmas. From this place, we can tap into our purpose to ensure its preservation. Place, purpose, preservation. This is perspective. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Perspective with Mike Bedenbaugh. And today we have a very special show where instead of interviewing one person, we're going to be interviewing three people around one subject, and that is community sovereignty. We have a lot we can talk about, but I want to share with you kind of the background on what this is about. All over the state of South Carolina and in the country as well is an assault on the democratic institutions that are within the cities that enable the development of overlay districts to protect what is deemed by the community important, either historic or viable buildings that believe need to be preserved in order to create a certain aesthetic and something that they believe can attract more sustainable economic activity. And there's an assault on those type of overlays all over the state right now. And it's disappointing because they really work really well. But there's a difference between long-term stability and short-term speculation. And unfortunately, that is what it looks like it's trying to win the day. But it's not in a case of Aiken, South Carolina, which is what we're very, very excited about and why we're committing a whole show to this. The city of Aiken, along with their development group and design review board, pushed through some plans to demolish almost half of a whole downtown of their historic core for new built buildings and new purposes and a parking garage. And many leaders of the city felt like this was a betrayal of their the intention of the overlay and what had been put into place for decades to protect the historic fabric of downtown Aiken. That has helped lead it to be one of the most vibrant small towns we have in the state. So, folks banded together along with several leading organizations in the city and the county, which is Historic Aiken Foundation, the Green Boundary Foundation, and the South Carolina Public Interest Foundation, along with several citizens, were plaintiffs, and they submitted that a suit to stop the action. Of course, the defendants, which was the city of Aiken's city council and behind their attorneys, tried to say they needed to withhold so much information. And so they kept putting up legal barriers to why this suit should not go forward. Well, almost a year later, the suit was filed in July, and now in June, almost 11 months later, we have a judgment against the defendants to say the plaintiffs do have a right to take depositions and to get the facts. This is a huge precedent. This is so important. Very rarely have people had the resources to be able to stand up and push back on actions like this. And this is going to be one of the most important decisions for towns to be able to protect their historic overlays and the ability of local communities to have the sovereignty to create systems to protect the uniqueness of their community. And Aiken is one of the most unique communities in the country. It is beautiful. It's attracted people from all over the world to come live there. And it is those very same people who have stood up and said, not on our watch. So we're going to have three interviews that kind of dive into this process. The suit, all of this is not over yet, but we want everybody to know about this so everybody can watch it. So we have three interviews. We have one of the attorneys for the plaintiffs, Mr. Mike Rose, an extraordinary man. I cannot wait for you to hear him. He's been here on the forefront of protecting citizens' rights in the face of government overreach for 50 years. An icon in this sector of law. Kristopher King, who is a native-born young man that came from Aiken and moved to Charleston. He's in real estate development in Charleston and was one of my colleagues in preservation for a period of time. He was president of director of the Preservation Society of Charleston. So he understands the challenges of protecting that within the real estate model and the challenges that Charleston is facing, just like Aiken is. Also, we have Mr. Donovan Repkema, a dear friend of this show and me personally. I've always admired Donovan whenever we could get together, met him through the meetings with the National Trust. Donovan runs a group called Place Economics and travels the world communicating to cities all over the world how important historic preservation is. But not only that, but showing the data to prove that it is. And so he brings a lot of really good insights on a bigger picture of why these type of overlays work so well and the national trend that is evident in trying to undermine them. So we made a decision this time, instead of having one long 1.5 or 2-hour episode, we're going to break this up in 3 smaller episodes centered around each of the interviews that we did. So this episode, we're going to start off with Kristopher King, who is a native of Aiken and someone who brings a very personal story to that, and also knowledge of what's taken place in other cities like Charleston and others around the state. So let's dive into the Kristopher's interview. Hello, Kristopher King. How are you?
I'm all right. How you doing?
Thank you so much for coming on. So, Kristopher, without me going into a big introduction, tell us who you are and why you're here in Aiken.
Well, I'm a native of Aiken. So I grew up here and then left for college and been living in Charleston for the past 25 years.
Yeah.
Working in historic preservation and real estate development as well. And I'm back visiting family.
That's wonderful. So we met because when I was head of preservation in South Carolina, you had just been hired as director of Preservation Society of Charleston.
Yeah. Well, we met long before that. I started at Historic Charleston Foundation back in the late 90s.
Oh.
And so I was there for about, between interns and full-time work, I was there for about 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then went into real estate development around 2006.
Gotcha.
So I know we'd crossed paths a few times, and I think it was maybe up in Abbeville at the State Preservation Conference.
Oh.
Which was a good one.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. Great town.
Oh, love Abbeville. And of course, yeah, it's one of my favorite towns, and we were fortunate enough to be able to help save the spire of Trinity while we were there. So we're a little limited on time. We had a great conversation with Mike Rose this morning, attorney for the plaintiffs for what's going on in Aiken. As someone from Aiken, can you just give some background on the trajectory of why this place ended up being bought by the city and wanted to be sold for a whole new type of development?
Sure.
Go back like 10 years on
Sure.
what was the trajectory of the hotel?
Yeah, and I don't know the specifics. I don't think many people do as to what happened. But, the reality is, growing up in Aiken, it was, it's always been a small town, but a very, very healthy downtown. There wasn't a lot of variety in retail, and, economic development really wasn't happening in the historic core of Aiken.
When you were growing up?
When I was very young, you had a lot of the development was out on the south side, sort of Kalmia Hill, Kalmia Plaza, areas like that.
Typical sprawl, malls, strip malls, all that stuff.
Everything moves out down Whiskey Road, and that's really been the focus for, at least 30 years, if not longer. Aiken downtown was kind of sleepy, but you had the barbers and, you had a hardware store. There were a couple little places to eat, a couple banks. It sort of had a pretty diverse range of businesses. But really, in the last 30 years, what you saw was really with some investment in the alley.
And the alley is an area in between the streets where they invested some infrastructure for restaurants and all of that.
Correct, and it's really adjacent to the Project Pascalis site. but there were two great restaurants in the alley and bars. And so all of a sudden you had a good nightlife, and it was it was a good place to be, and there was a lot going on. The Hotel Aiken at that time had sort of been reinvested in a little bit, and they had sort of gotten in on the nightlife game and had a pretty robust and active bar there, and put a restaurant up on the corner, although they had numerous different restaurants in that space. But, over my lifetime, just watching the downtown develop, I mean, as a kid, we had 3-story buildings that were just covered in vinyl siding, the sort of typical sort of lack of investment in downtowns, and the upper floors of the buildings were all vacant for the most part. And so watching some healthy businesses come in, seeing some upper floors get fixed up, seeing some buildings renovated, and then we had a local bank, Security Federal, really invested in renovating, restoring their building. And it sort of it only, as it only takes a couple of people doing some good restoration work to really kind of turn the trajectory of a main street.
It's amazing what good food, good music, and kind of a sense of
good buildings,
right? All that combined together, all of a sudden people wake up. Because what happened in the 60s, when people saw people fleeing to go to the suburban strip malls, they then tried to turn the downtown into a strip mall, thinking that's what will bring them back.
Yep.
And it was...
Well, and as I was a kid, Aiken has a completely unique plan, as you know, with the sort of the parkways. And so you have this incredible primary right-of-way for downtown. So there's a ton of parking compared to any other town. And so as kids, you'd always, you would never have to park anywhere but directly in front of the place you were going. And I know that a lot of the conversation that I've sort of heard secondhand primarily was, there's not enough parking in downtown Aiken. And you get ingrained in using an urban space in certain ways, and I've always been sort of amazed that there's been conversation about a parking garage for 20 years, and it's all you have to do is go a block in either direction, and there's plenty of parking.
Yeah,
it's a totally walkable downtown, and so that's sort of been a rumor and a conversation point, I think, really from the city and in the name of economic development.
Let's go back a little bit. Since you're from Aiken, give a little bit of quick history on how Aiken ended up being here and being formed and why it looks the way it does.
Yeah, I'm not a professional historian, but I think the sort of the quick story is it was a winter colony, and so William Aiken from Charleston, as you know, builds the rail line up to sort of maybe take some goods off the Savannah River from the port of Savannah and bring it
the best friend of Charleston that everybody knows. So the rail line from Charleston went up to a place called Hamburg, where trying to intervene on the river traffic going to Savannah to take it to Charleston, and Aiken was along that line.
And longest rail line in the world when it's built.
Right. And this is 1830s,
40s, yeah. Yep. And so Aiken was really farmland. And, as the rail line is going in, towns are getting laid out along the way, Somerville and Aiken being probably the two most notable, and also both possessing very unique urban plans. In Savannah, they have the alternating blocks of developed blocks and park-like blocks, but that doesn't sort of hold up very long because the park-like blocks start to be developed very early on. So when Aiken's laid out, they do the parkways.
So they did wide streets with parkways, with park open space in between the streets.
Sort of coming from the Jefferson, the idea of healthier cities and trees are being so important. So, Aiken has these just massive right-of-ways. So you have a one-way street, sort of a football field width parkway, and then the other one-way street on the other side, which if you're not from Aiken, you see lots of people struggling to make it through our intersections because it's a unique place to drive around, but it creates a really unique urban form.
Well, it's made for people walking and slow, and so it's amazing how much Aiken has protected those parkways with the coming of automobiles.
Absolutely.
I know they compromise them like on Newberry Street and things like that for parking for downtown, but it's incredible you still have so many.
No question. But, so the rail infrastructure is really what brings the town about. There's early development, 19th century development, but what really happens is at the turn of the century, you have a lot of wealthy northern families that can bring their Pullman cars on the train right into Aiken, and Aiken has very sandy soil. So for those, doing the equestrian pursuits, Aiken was ideal. Very sandy soil. So you see a lot of families, and particularly from New York, Long Island area, bringing down their games, and this really becomes a winter colony of sport. So we have, I believe, the second oldest 18-hole golf course in the country. We have a tennis court here, designed by and built by Stanford White. There are only 11 of those in America. So again, you have these very unique, very non-Southern institutions here, and horse racing is very early, and polo is very early. Aiken was the polo capital of the world in the sort of 1930s. And so this brings a great influx of wealth and people who come to realize the benefits of living in a place like Aiken. So there's a great boom in the first half of the 20th century. Lots of houses being built.
Fine, magnificent houses.
Very spectacular houses. But it's sort of interesting because a lot of these families are coming down and from places like Newport, Rhode Island, where they have their grand mansions. But in Aiken, they take a very decidedly different approach, which they like to sort of play poor. And so a lot of our houses, some of our most grand houses from the street look like 1.5-story houses, but you go around to the backside and they're not 1.5. They're quite grand 2- and 3-story houses. So Aiken has a very interesting sort of architectural history of very grand houses sort of masquerading as much more simple houses.
So you had an economy that built the downtown rooted in all this wealth coming in seasonally. So you had the big hotels, of which Hotel Aiken was one of them that was improved and made better as all that happened as a downtown hotel.
Yeah, like many communities, you have a couple of the early almost destination resort hotels where people could escape, places like Charleston and come for the better climate and healthier living in the summertime. And then you sort of get the second wave of hotels, which is catering more towards the winter colony, which is what we call the sort of historic residential area. And so you have like the Wilcox Hotel and then the Hotel Aiken, very much catering to those crowds.
So what we have set up then is kind of queued up the notion that Aiken has a very unique history to any city in South Carolina, much less South Carolina, but also in the country. Yeah. And unique architectural standards by trained architects, and it created a sense of space. So even though you had that, like most towns did, that kind of reactionary the reactionary abandonment of downtown for suburbs with cars, and then people are now starting to come back when a little bit of investment went in, and now people realize this is a cool place to be, the thing. And so me being from prosperity, I enjoy getting in my car, driving an hour, and coming into a place that there's no town like Aiken to come to. And the walkability, the antique malls, the restaurants. I mean, I can go from one place and get sushi into
Mike,
another place.
Because you've been, worked extensively all over the entire state. Aiken has the healthiest downtown of any small, mid-sized community in the state. I mean, it's unbelievable to me. And I've always, had the perspective of leaving to be able to come back and realize how not only special it is, but how vibrant and healthy it is. And I think, you hear a lot of conversation, and this is every community. I mean, economic development, we need more or we need something different. But the reality is Aiken, downtown Aiken has an incredible mix of businesses and buildings and restaurants, and it has so much going for it. And so I think it's really, the conversation should be more about how do we actually improve what we've got. Take what we've got, sustain it, and add to it, not how do we sort of create a whole new scheme to come in and create more economic development, when the reality is the brand of economic development we have is historically appropriate. And as I said, there's just no other place like it.
It's not. So we get to the modern time in the past 5 years where there has been a trend over the past 10 years, well, probably 20, to try to diminish local historic guidelines and preservation. So as the town is becoming more viable downtowns, businesses, stores, people are being attracted to historic downtown Aiken. We have all the brown signs coming in downtown. And so there is protective overlays and design review to try to protect, to make sure you don't have speculative development destroying the goose that's laying the golden egg, because people love coming for the pedestrian aspect of it. It appears to be, and I've talked with this with Mike earlier, it appears to be a concerted effort by certain folks to empower speculative development and come in and undermine local controls over economic development.
I mean, Mike, we're seeing that everywhere.
It's
That's
everywhere,
not an
isn't
Aiken
it?
thing. I mean, I'm from Charleston. And
So what is your
Charleston-
experience in Charleston? Because that's one of the big things I want to talk about is this is a national phenomenon, and especially in the state of South Carolina.
Yeah.
Because Mike this morning talked about this is the big real estate boom in South Carolina with money and development and corporate development groups coming in and taking advantage of our lax way of
No question.
protections.
And you're seeing it nationally, but I think you hit the nail on the head. South Carolina is in its biggest boom period in a very, very long time. And so it's attracting incredible wealth for development or investment money. And that's here for one reason, and that's to make money. It's not to make friends. It's not to make better communities. It's to figure out what the best pro forma is to extract as much wealth from the state of South Carolina as possible. So, it's sort of come as a surprise to me to sort of watch what's happened over the last 20 years. But as you know, preservation was the economic development tool for decades. Fix it and they will come.
The Main Street program that helped organize that. And
I mean, look at downtown Charleston.
right.
Fix it and they will come. We now are in a catastrophic over-tourism situation in Charleston. We have residents leaving the city at an unprecedented rate.
So here's a good point. For you to have a livable, workable city made that constitute with huge, big homes that represented a certain wealth level, how do you entice people to want to come and invest their wealth into these big homes and make it a town they want to live in? And that's an issue you have in Charleston,
Yeah,
isn't
and
it?
so it was always the fear is if it becomes not a great place to live, then people will leave it. And then the houses and the historic buildings are what suffers. The reality is to buy a house in a place like Charleston, you're talking, $4 and $5 million plus houses that cost $100,000 to $200,000 a year in taxes and insurance and basic maintenance. Not talking about painting the house, because that's another $100,000 to $150,000 just to paint a house every 5 to 7 years. These are very expensive houses to upkeep at this point in time. So the reality is the homeowners and the local business owners are the ones that created the economic development. And now they're the ones that are sort of getting left behind because there's so much more money to be made from the visitor, from the person that doesn't spend more than 48 hours in your town. The state taxes it, the county taxes it. Everybody's making money off of it. So now we're invested in more. And so Charleston was the number one city in the world or the universe for 13 some odd years. And the difference between Charleston before and now is shocking. And
that's because so much investment's going in just to house as many visitors as possible.
When I worked in real estate development 20 years ago, all the developers in Charleston were local developers, right? They call them country club developers, right? They know somebody that plays golf with an accountant who knows some people who might be interested in investing in a local project, right? Everybody meets everybody, and you go raise some money, you build your project, which in retrospect was such a great control mechanism. Because when you have locals invested in projects, they don't want to be associated with projects that people really don't like. But what's happened is all the local developers have been pushed out because the hedge funds and the Chinese capital and money from all over the world has identified this as a top market to generate returns. And so they can pay more. They can do projects for a smaller return. They can have income-producing properties that generate half of the return that anyone who would go get financing would ever need, because these are parts of much larger, sort of suite of investments. And so it's really changed the game. And so we don't have local knowledge and local characters in development anymore, except for the lawyers that help them navigate through the local processes.
So how can you mitigate the damage from things like that? Do overlays and stuff help slow that down, or is that why they're attacking the overlays so much?
That's why they're attacking. I mean, the reality is Charleston had the most robust set of protections of really any community, and those got completely overturned by one developer. that challenged it, took it to court, and then, between the judicial pressure and now the political pressure, these ordinances are getting weakened greatly. Charleston does not have the strong framework of protection that it enjoyed a decade ago.
Wow, I didn't realize that it was that bad.
Yeah. So there was a big lawsuit over the Sergeant Jasper, and there was wording in the ordinance that everybody knew was a liability. The city knew it, but they chose never to correct it, and so it was like a Trojan horse for a developer to exploit. And they were successful. And the Preservation Society and other groups had challenged it, and we were going off to court, and the city settled with them. And part of that settlement was they got rid of the old ordinance and created a new one. And the idea being that the new one would be more prescriptive, so that everyone would understand more clearly what the expectations were. And it's not been positive. I think before that lawsuit, the BAR had been challenged a handful of times in 70 years. Since that lawsuit, and I'm a little bit dated now because I've been out for a few years, but I think there were 13 challenges in the first, 5-6 years, and the city settled in favor of the development, I think 12 of the 13 times. So they've made the rules easier, and they've told everyone very clearly, if you choose to fight us, we will not fight. And then one of the biggest complications is the state of South Carolina has a very problematic law, which is called pretrial mediation. So if there is a lawsuit between a city and a developer, they can say, we would like to go into pretrial mediation, which they go behind closed doors, no public involvement, no due process or anything like that. The two parties go behind closed doors, hammer out a deal, and they come out, and it's all done. And so we're seeing that happen with great frequency.
And that's added to because of the culture of belief that development's good. Yeah. Progress. What is progress?
It was done during the recession to help sort of expedite lawsuits from holding up development, right? So it was done at a time where the desire was to have more economic development because of the recession. But now we're in this boom time. And I mean, this is the name of the game. People will go in and say, well, this rule is unfair because it unfairly restricts long-term residents, or it unfairly restricts African-American-owned businesses. You pick whatever it is, but we need to fix it for these groups that are disenfranchised or haven't been able to prosper with everybody else. But the reality is that's what they say they're doing, but it's the developers that prosper.
That's just a rhetorical flourish to give the developers a chance to come in. So, and I want to be clear, and I want us to be clear on this point, is the difference between development and investors coming in and investing in your community versus the sovereignty of the community to protect what its citizens want, where the citizens want to live. Mm-hmm. What's the difference in that, and how do you see that playing out?
Well, I mean, they're polar opposites. Because, you have a community, and let's be honest, sometimes residents in neighborhoods can be overly against things. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things in Charleston and working and running a professional preservation organization is you always want to sort of figure out what the best outcome is and how you can arrive at it. But lots of residents will just say no. And I've had to have a lot of hard conversations with people to say, but look, it's a piece of land. It has developable rights, and you cannot take rights away from a landowner. So you need to understand what is allowed, and if it is allowed, it can happen. And if you want something different, you have to figure out how to engage with the city and the property owner in a different way. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what it really kind of boils down to, is that you have these built-in rights. Now, in a place like Charleston, those rights have gotten bigger and a little more loose. So that makes the community struggle that much more to try and retain a sense of control. And it's not trying to control all the minutia, but it's trying to control the trajectory and the balance.
The thing that's fascinating is back when you mentioned the alley here in Aiken, there is a need for municipalities to invest in their areas when there's a depressed market there. And, how do we get something here to help jumpstart? Aiken did that with the alley. Newberry did that with the Opera House. Charleston did that by being Charleston and protecting and all that.
Charleston Place development was,
That's right.
was the catalyst.
It was the catalyst to help bring tourists and everything in. But then,
well, let me not to cut you off, but
please.
Communities go through this ebb and flow, and so there are lean years, and as you know, preservation thrives when the economy stinks because nobody's doing anything and people aren't tearing stuff down and doing objectionable stuff. And in Charleston ultimately was the great beneficiary of 100 years of disinvestment, and that's why it is what it is.
It is. So check Charleston compared to Savannah, and you'll see what would have happened to Charleston if it would have had more of an economy.
But I look at communities a little bit differently, that how often is it that you get the opportunity to invest in your community, and what's the best way to do it? That's what nobody talks about, nobody thinks about, and that's where I think a lot of local leadership in every community, because we're reactive, right? We're trying to put out fires and keep up with the business and make sure the garbage goes out on time and the police and the fire departments have what they need. But the reality is how often does a community say, like in Charleston, they had the aquarium, a $40 million investment. And my attitude is what is the best that we can do with $40 million? And it might not have been an aquarium. It certainly wouldn't have been my choice at that point in time. So when you sort of jumping back to Aiken and look at a project like the Project Pascalis, when you have this opportunity, this moment to inject a lot of money into your community, is what they're proposing the best idea? And I think it was resoundingly no in the case of Project Pascalis.
Well, it was. I mean, I was shocked. And I guess that's my point is when you're sitting here and looking at a community, you put this type of investment in when it's depressed. I come downtown, and you had mentioned earlier, people complain there's no parking spots. Well, that shows how vibrant it is.
Yeah.
And just because it's vibrant and just because there's a lot of people coming doesn't mean, well, let's make things bigger so we can get more people coming, more congestion.
Yeah, and I don't think the community thinks let's make it bigger. The developers do.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
But I think what happens in a place like Aiken is, we work in hysterical preservation, right? A lot of communities don't understand the value of the historic buildings and the creating long-term sustainable value. So, tearing down a dilapidated old building and putting a new hotel, you go to 9 out of 10 people, they'll be like, yeah, that's great. But what nobody's talking about is the potential that you're giving away by demolishing a fantastic hotel building and replacing it with something that could be anywhere. And I think it's that sense of place and history and material quality that people just don't understand. What I heard repeatedly is, well, that building is in bad shape. You can't save it. It's got to go. Well, in Charleston, that wouldn't even be the conversation. You have to save it.
Well, but the thing is, and this is what is so frustrating, is and it's endemic to our culture. We have a culture in our country of remaking yourself, rebuilding yourself, and we also, with our consumptive throwaway culture, where it's all about consuming new things. We have a society that a lot of folks believe if it's dilapidated, it means it's not working, so thus must get out of the way. And that's what's so frustrating, because most of these places that are dilapidated are either one, intentional dilapidation, or just absolute negligence of owners who refuse to really do the research to understand how they can make something out of it with what's there.
Yeah, and many owners think that if you clear the lot and have just a piece of developable land, that's more valuable than the property with a hotel or the existing building on it. But you've been around the state much more than I have. How many communities can you point at where they made a big investment and didn't get it right?
Well, I'll tell you this, when you talk about demolishing, whenever I go into a small town and there's a new developer there giving all these promises, but if the first thing he says, but you must get rid of this, and then we'll be able to do these wonderful things. If that's their first thing they say, it usually never works, because you go in any of these small towns, you see all these vacant spots in downtowns, and in historic districts where there's a vacant spot. Once they're torn down, usually they stay empty.
Yep.
in most places, because the value of the infrastructure of the fabric of the building, no matter, I tell you, it has to be really dilapidated for it not to be resurrected in some way to help add to the aesthetic of the community. But that as a value in itself. And unfortunately, our current real estate models tend to neglect that aspect of it.
Yeah, and look, there's sort of a systemic problem with the type of projects that you and I love to see, right? Banks want easy lending. You know, it's easier to lend on a hotel building that they've already built hundreds of. They're all over the country. We know exactly what it costs, how it's put together, how it's going to perform, versus, you know, having to get engineers to look at an old building. Look, here's the thing. It's never easier with an historic building, but it almost always creates better long-term value. So it's sort of acknowledging the fact that we got to do the hard work, and if we do, we're going to be beneficiaries for a long period of time. Any building they would put in that location within 10 years would look dated, and people would look at it and say, that was a mistake. And that's what I talk about when I travel. I go to so many cities, and you see these massive investments that within a decade of them being built, you know, oh, well, that was a project of its time. Well, historic buildings are timeless. So don't try to overthink it. You know, work with them, make them better, make them accessible, make them vibrant and viable. And, you know, we're going to be having a conversation about the same building 100 years from now. Well, you and I won't be, but hopefully others will.
Well, so here's the thing I really want to dig into is this corporatocracy that has fed a very easy alleyway to bring in corporate investment, and it's supported by corporate banking, mostly global money, and it's kind of a roadmap that, without really thinking, these outside groups can come in and just pave their way right into and extract the local resources and make it something else, which is why you see apartments all looking the same now and all of that. And that's what they wanted to do down here.
It's amazing. When I first started working in Charleston, you'd have a developer from out of town would come before the Board of Architectural Review, and it's like the board would rise up to let them know, I don't care how you do it, where you come from, but that's not how we do it in Charleston. Which is a little bit backwards, but at the same time, there was this protectionist aspect to it. Well, now again, all the developers come in, they're like, oh, well, we've done 100 of these in Texas, or we've done them all over the Southeast or the Midwest or the Northeast, which is great. And you know, you have developers that, like any developer, they have some great projects. They've even done some great renovation projects. But when you look at what people are primarily trying to do, it's make money. And they have really, really, really good lawyers. I remember talking to the city planning director on a downtown project in Charleston, and he said, Kristopher, he goes, that lawyer, he called me and just literally told me exactly why he was going to beat us, how he was going to beat us, and how he could make the zoning ordinance do whatever he needed it to do. And he goes, and Kristopher, he's right.
Well, this gets to the point of local sovereignty, of municipal sovereignty, and it has nothing to do with stopping economic development. It has everything to do with the sovereignty of citizens who decide where they want to live, where they want to make investments, and have a predictable environment that they can flourish in and have a good quality of life.
Yep.
And that's what's being undermined.
Yeah, I think, look no further than a comprehensive plan.
Yeah.
Right. We never had comprehensive planning in South Carolina until, 99?
I was on the board in Newberry County when we had the first one done in 2002.
Yeah, I think the Comprehensive Planning Act was done in 98 or 99, requiring every community to have a comprehensive plan. Well, in Charleston, for example, they just redid the comprehensive plan, and I was running the Preservation Society at the time. And, you know, there are so many aspects of the plan that require, feedback and input from the community. But it seems like municipalities sort of go through the motions. And it seems like a lot of time the city planners kind of almost have an attitude like, oh, well, you don't know what you need, we'll tell you what you need. But it's also the fact that they're not using these tools the right way. So in Charleston, we redid our comprehensive plan, and one of the things that we fought really hard on is that the State Ports Authority owns almost 70 acres of developable land called Union Pier, which is currently being entitled as we speak. And we said, look, you have got to put forward your vision for that development in the comprehensive plan. It's required by law. If they're going to redevelop that whole area, it has to be consistent with the comprehensive plan. And they said, oh, no. And they wouldn't talk about it. They refused. They didn't do it. And all it says is identified as future planning area. So it has no guardrails, no aspirations. And so, I look at planning as very simple. You have your comprehensive plan, which is our aspirational, what do we want to be as a community and how are we going to get there? And then that filters down into the zoning ordinance and the planning commission board and the zoning board and the board of architectural review, right? They're there to help implement that plan. These communities don't pay attention to these plans. They're not thinking long-term. And so, not having a plan, it leaves more optionality on the table. And all these big developments, the developers come in and say, well, look, we're not going to limit ourselves to a defined plan because the market could change. And we need that flexibility, particularly with big projects, right, that might take a decade plus to build out. They will not commit. So we had a project in Charleston where they said, we want this to be like the future home of Amazon. It's a whole old landfill site, a couple hundred acres, 190 acres. And they said, we want 2 million square feet of office. That's what we want out there. And we looked at it and said, well, that's actually, it's a lot, but it's a good use for that area. And they said, we'll do 4,000, single family units, probably apartments, but it doesn't specify whether it's a condo or an apartment. But if you read the language of the plan, what it said is they're only required to do 10% of the commercial square footage. And they were allowed, if that's the case, then they were allowed to go up to 11,000 and change on the residential units. There are only about 5,000 houses on the peninsula in Charleston. And you were going to double that in one development on the peninsula. It would be chaos. And we were able to fight it and get it down to 7,000 units. But I promise you, we're not going to have 2,000 square feet of commercial. 2 million square feet of commercial. We're not even going to have a million. You're going to have 7,000 houses and like 250,000 square feet of commercial space.
And the reason that's a problem is because then you put the burden on the public and the tax base to put in the infrastructure to support that many people, the widening of the roads, the lighting, the police protection.
Everything's done off TIFs, and so the school district is losing tons of money. Obviously, it'll generate it down the road, but you're sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul in a lot of ways, and TIFs have become, the tax increment financing has become the sort of developer's dream of getting the community to invest in the infrastructure, but yet they're not asking the community to invest in the plan or even have any input into the plan. So it's fraught with problems, if you ask me.
So where we are here in Aiken is an issue that the lawsuit just had a great thing where the judge has ruled that it was legitimate and they did have the right to take depositions for everyone, because basically, according to Mike Rose in our interview earlier, it's really all about the law. And I mean, communities can change the law if they want. The state can change the law, but the law that's in place is usually undermined because of the short-term, quick, and the passions that's involved with somebody coming up and saying, I'm going to invest $30 million in your community. All of a sudden, everybody has an incentive to try to figure out how to wiggle around what the law was, and they diminish the importance of why that law is there.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, in South Carolina, in my experience, we find that the law is not on our side as much as it should be on the preservation side. We've had so many lawsuits gone to the state Supreme Court because every time, whether it's conservation or preservation, there is a lawsuit, they throw it out saying that the nonprofits and the neighbors don't have standing. And so there's always this fight over who can even challenge a development, who has a say. So, I think what's happened with this judge's ruling in Aiken is
it's precedent making.
It's much bigger than Aiken. I mean, it's a statewide precedent setting ruling. And so, we've been working for decades to get rulings like this. So it's, this has a benefit for preservation all over the state.
Well, that's why I wanted to make this the subject of one of my shows, because that's what makes this so important, is it helps set the template for what other communities can do. And also it helps through the legal system communicate to developers who try to undermine by working directly with development groups inside the cities and town council members and attorneys. Here's the guardrails you have to stay within. You want to change the law? Fine. Go through the way to do that. I suspect they know they won't be able to because communities understand, especially in towns like this. And Aiken is fortunate. It's similar to Charleston in the sense, but Aiken's fortunate than other smaller towns this size because it has a good population of people who have the education and the means to stand up and say, stop. And that's why this has happened here and why it hasn't happened in other places. And we're really excited that this will be something that can hopefully diminish the zeal of the destruction, what ends up being the destruction of our small town atmosphere and the economics in those places. Yeah,
I was sort of stunned when I did glance through the initial lawsuit at the sort of shenanigans that had gone into bringing it all about. And you just see this stuff happening everywhere. In Charleston, with the same union peer development, it's not in the comprehensive plan. So they went to the planning commission last week to amend the comprehensive plan to make it urban core, which is basically our most dense area, which every plan in Charleston has basically said you don't put the density by the water, you put it in the center of the peninsula. But what they've done is they got turned down by the Technical Review Commission, and normally you would wait until that's done before you go to the planning commission. They said, no, the law sort of says you don't have to do that, so we're going to go ahead and go forward. So they went forward. The planning commission did not vote, so they've deferred it for a month. And now the expectation is they'll come back. Doesn't matter what the planning commission vote will be, because even if they deny it, oh, by the way, they changed the law a few years back that they don't need a supermajority of council to overrule a negative vote of the planning commission. They'll need a simple majority. So it's 7 votes versus 10, which is a big difference. But now, furthermore, they'll then go straight to city council, because ultimately city council will make the decision. And what we see in Charleston is a lot of the attitude that, well, we're the council members, we are elected, we make the decisions. The Board of Architectural Review, the Design Review Board, the Planning Commission, they do not make the decisions, we do. And so you've seen this in communities like Charleston, this taking of the power by council. Council will make the decision. So they will basically break every procedure, where it's not the law, it's the procedure, and they'll do it their own way, and council will ultimately reward them in a lot of these situations. And so if a community isn't really up to speed on this stuff and all over it, or has a local organization that's educating everybody, which even if that's happening, sometimes people still don't understand it because this stuff is very technical. You just see the whole process is it's just kind of opening up and allowing developers to kind of shoot the gap in all the protections and the procedures. And, we're not seeing great outcomes as a result.
Well, I'm happy about what they were able to do here. That's a huge win for community sovereignty, right here in Aiken. So it's been 41 minutes. What other final thoughts do you have?
I will say I was shocked when I read the lawsuit. I was shocked at what was sort of how decisions were being made by the city and by the Aiken Development Corporation. I think the lawsuit was so timely and needed. It had to be done. And so I was positively surprised by the response by the city. And then all of a sudden it did change the outcome. Right, which is that's the first thing. But you have to fix the problem. You can't. It's not about stopping a development. And I'm a process guy, and I believe process has to work for everybody, including the developer. So everybody knows what to expect going into it. So I think it was a huge win for process. But I think for me, when I look at what's happening in Aiken and Beaufort and Charleston and about every community that I've worked in and know well, they're all dealing with similar issues like this.
Yeah, they are.
And I think it's up to the elected officials and it's up to the citizens to make sure that their elected officials make a priority of good process and good preservation. And they're two different things, But I think, if you can get those two things right, your community is going to do very well in the long term and have long-term sustainable value.
That's awesome. Thanks, Kristopher. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Glad to do it.
All righty.
All right.